60 Minutes Overtime.
For me and my military brothers and sisters who are hurt, being issued a Purple Heart is acknowledgment of our sacrifice, the sacrifice we made that affects not only us, but also our families.
This week on 60 Minutes, we bring you the latest in our report, Targeting Americans. For more than a decade, U.S. diplomats, intelligence officers, and military personnel have suffered serious brain injuries with no clear cause. The government has long said it was unlikely that these injuries were caused by a weapon, since no such weapon was known to exist. But this week, we report on a classified mission that appears to have discovered just that, a directed energy weapon that could cause these kinds of injuries. The condition became known as Havana Syndrome after some of the first cases were reported at the U.S. Embassy in Cuba. The Americans targeted in these attacks have suffered permanent damage to their vision, hearing, balance, and thinking.
I had significant symptoms. We ended up finding out that I had lost half of my hearing in my left ear, and had a lot of disorientation, confusion, dizziness. That also began the cognitive changes, particularly the anxiety.
Chris and Heidi asked us not to use their last name. Chris retired as a lieutenant colonel working on highly classified spy satellites. He told us he was attacked 5 times in his Northern Virginia home in 2020.
The 5th one was by far the worst, and that was early December. And I woke up with a full body convulsion. The worst pain I have ever felt. It felt like a vice gripping my brainstem. And I tried to fall back asleep. And each time when I closed my eyes, as soon as my eyelids touched, I would have a full body convulsion.
For the purposes of the VA and all of that, are you considered disabled?
100% permanent total.
Who do you think did this?
Russia.
That was a quick answer.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think so?
They're the only country that I have ever essentially crossed, and who made themselves known that they were actively surveilling me.
So the work that you were doing related in some way to Russia?
Russia took a keen interest in many of the things that I worked, yes.
Heidi, how does it strike you that the government will not at this point acknowledge that any of these people have been attacked?
Having served, being a spouse of someone who's served for 20 years, I understand that that is much broader than our individual lives. With that said, I do think that there is enough evidence out there now that some formal acknowledgement that this has happened is good for our nation, but also for the people who have suffered. That acknowledgement of, you gave us your service and we acknowledge that you were hurt in the line of that service.
In 1782, General George Washington created an award called the Badge of Military Merit. For the next 150 years, only 3 soldiers received it. Then, in 1932, General Douglas MacArthur revived the award and renamed it the Purple Heart. Today, the Purple Heart is given to U.S. service members who are wounded or killed by enemy action. About 1.8 million Purple Hearts have been awarded, but whether military victims of Havana Syndrome qualify is still being debated.
It's not something that should be all too controversial.
Mark Polymeropoulos rose to an executive level at the CIA before, he says, he was struck in a Havana Syndrome attack in 2017. He knows a fellow victim who served in the military whose superiors tried to officially recognize his Havana Syndrome injuries.
He was treated at Walter Reed. He did everything right in terms of getting treatment, and his superiors put him in for an award, which is the Purple Heart. That's a line of injury award, and he was approved of this. Yet, at the very last second, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency at the time rescinded the Purple Heart. This is even after this individual was told about it and an award ceremony was scheduled. The excuse was that, well, the intelligence community has not assessed this was actually something that occurred, so we cannot give someone the Purple Heart. How do you think that U.S. military officer who has served faithfully, how do you think they feel?
One source close to the incident agreed that the award was rescinded because it went against an intelligence community assessment which says Havana Syndrome is very unlikely to be the result of attacks by a foreign adversary. In other words, Havana Syndrome injuries have not been officially linked to enemy action, which is required for the Purple Heart. But this source said that it was the Army that issued and then canceled the award. The director of the Defense Intelligence Agency at the time was Lieutenant General Jeffrey Cruz. He declined to comment on the record. The Trump administration fired him in August of 2025. There were reports at the time that his dismissal was because Cruz's agency had publicly challenged President Trump's claim that U.S. strikes last June had wiped out Iran's nuclear sites. But Republican Congressman Rick Crawford, the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, has been investigating the intelligence community's conclusions on Havana Syndrome. In an email to 60 Minutes, Crawford said, "I recommended at the time that the former DIA director, Cruz, be removed for cause. The reason is directly related to his actions in a specific AHI survivor's case." AHI is how the government refers to Havana Syndrome, calling these acts not attacks, but anomalous health incidents. The Department of Defense declined to comment when asked about awarding military victims the Purple Heart. Chris, what should the government do now?
I think they need to take a step back, particularly with their intelligence community assessments, and reassess.
The Purple Heart would mean what to you?
It would tell me that they understand that I made that sacrifice for the country while serving in the military, and give me that closure that I'm looking for.